Winston Churchill warned about this moment. A moment made up of 13 agonizing days, when time stood still, with the world poised on the brink of nuclear war. President Kennedy's week began badly. Cuba was a charged issue again. On the floor of the UN General Assembly, and during a meeting with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin, JFK arrived in Hyannisport on Saturday, hoping to end the week on a better note. On the same Saturday, one young couple got married, and another counted the days to their wedding 2 weeks away. Lieutenant Sal Orozco, B-47 pilot attached to the Strategic Air Command at March Air Force Base, spent more weekends here than he did at home with wife Barbara. On the domestic front, Don Campbell, who just sold his trucking business and invested in the stock market, went trout fishing to relax from a week of watching Dow Jones reports at his broker's office. And second grader Jeff shot hoops, hoping to improve his game before school on Monday. Across the nation, others went about their weekend, shopping, gardening, playing, as if they had all the time in the world. They didn't. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy was hosting a dinner in his Washington, D.C. home when the Central Intelligence Agency called. Until yesterday, no U-2 photo reconnaissance planes had overflown Cuba in a month. When the first plane's film magazine was developed and interpreted, the results were startling. A field near San Cristobal showed evidence that medium-range ballistic missile sites were under construction, Soviet style, and probably being armed with nuclear warheads. Already, surface-to-air missiles guarded the site. After more hushed phone calls, Bundy decided to sit on the information until morning, choosing to let the president sleep. He knew Kennedy would need it. At the start of the Cold War 16 years earlier, Winston Churchill warned of this moment when he coined the phrase Iron Curtain and told of communism's intention to dominate the globe. By 1950, the U.S. was developing covert Cold Warfare, and its chief target had a Russian accent. A decade later, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev validated Churchill's warning in a chilling speech to Western diplomats. Cuba entered the Cold War late in the game. Our earliest relationship with the island nation was as an ally, and then as a partner in defense. But all that changed in 1959. Fidel Castro's guerrillas ousted President Juan Batista, and old allegiances died. One more country took sides in the battle of communism versus democracy, and this ex-ally was just 80 miles from the U.S. In the context of these global politics, President Kennedy approved the CIA's Bay of Pigs invasion, part of a plan of covert actions directed against Castro. Called Operation Mongoose, this secret plan was launched by Eisenhower. But while most of the actions failed, they'd at least been secret failures. Not so the Bay of Pigs. JFK first heard details about the plan to liberate Cuba right after his inauguration. Uncertain about its success, he sought the opinion of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It'll work, they assured him. Photographed on April 4th as he returned from a trip to Florida, it's likely he got a first-hand look at the training site and the way things were supposed to work. But he hadn't learned the whole truth. As it turned out, the operation was doomed to fail. It was designed around false assumptions and false promises of support. Even though the operation was a leftover from Eisenhower, Kennedy publicly accepted responsibility. He became the scapegoat for U.S. anger, for international humiliation, and for abandoning 1,500 brigade fighters, many who were killed or taken prisoner by Castro.
I was shocked that those men who went to the Bay of Pigs invasion were not supported by any kind of air support that they should have gotten, and it was terrible.
Despite the Bay of Pigs, which turned up the heat on the Cold War, Americans paid more attention to the upcoming congressional election or personal events than to the potential of war with Cuba or Russia.
I was busy working and going to school and planning a wedding and having difficulty communicating with my fiancé, husband-to-be. It was hard. I had to do everything. I couldn't have him available. I had to make all the decisions.
I was drafted. I was teaching school in Los Angeles on the edge of Watts, and I got my papers. There were times when I didn't know if I would get through officers candidate school. They didn't give you a clue whether you would get through it or not. So I did this. I would call about once a week, line up at the telephone and call and act, I guess, as if I was going to get through, but underneath I didn't know for sure.
In 1961, I was 7 years old, and I was probably about second grade. I lived in a rural area of the Central Valley of California. A lot of my time was occupied on an old wooden backboard out by the barn playing basketball. There were 6 of us in the family, 4 kids, and we lived probably a typical rural life.
I'm from Fresno. I graduated from Fresno State University, got a commission. I was told to be in San Antonio within a very short time. And even though I said, I've got a job, I'm established, I'm not a military guy, they said, Sonny, you be there. And the gentleman at the Selective Service was emphatic, and I was there in San Antonio, where I went through a series of tests. And they got me into the flying game. A year and a half later, I met my wife. The first big assignment was the B-47. And my first station was at March Air Force Base with Strategic Air Command.
The reason I went in the trucking business is because I'd been fired twice from 2 jobs, and I figured I could do a better job than either one of them. So I went and I bought a truck, started with the 1 truck. I did run into a buddy of mine that had told me that this company in West Sacramento was going to expand, and the name of that was Western Highway Oil.
1 truck purchased in 1949 became a fleet of 7, and when Western Highway Oil merged with Signal Oil, Don liquidated his company and put the proceeds into the stock market.
The stock market, that was fun. First stock I bought was RCA, 10 shares at $20 a share. When I sold it, I didn't have it over 6 months. I sold it and I picked up $400 easy dollars on that transaction. But it was a roller coaster ride.
That ride meant tracking the averages that rose and fell daily, and it meant paying a lot more attention to the Dow Jones Index than to U.S. foreign policy regarding Cuba or Russia. Foreign policy wasn't what the analysts had in mind when they saw the buildings and crates photographed at San Cristobal, Cuba, during the October 14th U-2 flight. Instead, they suspected that policy was about to be replaced by preparation for war. McGeorge Bundy saw the San Cristobal photographs at 8 a.m. and went directly to the president's bedroom. He didn't mince words. "Mr. President, there is now hard photographic evidence that the Russians have offensive missiles in Cuba. Before noon, a group of key advisors assembled. They heard reports that the San Cristobal site would be operational in 10 days, reducing the warning time the U.S. had of an attack from 15 to 2 minutes. The men, who would soon be part of a group called the XCOM, deliberated the options. A surgical airstrike on the missile bases, strikes on the sites and other Cuban facilities, an all-out invasion, a naval blockade to stop more equipment from reaching Cuba. At the end of the evening meeting, Robert Kennedy passed his brother a note. I now know how Tojo felt when he was planning Pearl Harbor. The group favored military action. The president wanted more information. U-2 reconnaissance planes flew 6 missions over Cuba that day. Members of the XCOM met all day without the president. The results of yesterday's U-2 flights were grim. San Cristobal now housed at least 16 completed medium-range ballistic missiles with a 1,000-mile range, and intermediate-range ballistic missile sites with a 2,000-mile range were spotted at other locations. This meant that the Soviets could launch 40 nuclear warheads at the U.S. and hit targets as far west as Montana. Head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Maxwell Taylor, attended the meeting and recommended an airstrike. The new intelligence report supported his contention that nothing else would stop the Soviets. As of that morning, IRBMs in Cuba were aimed at specific American cities and the 80 million people who live there. In spite of the shock and anger among XCOM advisors at this latest news, Robert Kennedy raised ethical questions. Is a surprise airstrike ethical? Several members scoffed, but most wondered the same thing. Sometime earlier, President Kennedy had scheduled a meeting with Andrei Gromyko at the White House and decided to keep it, but he avoided mentioning the discovery of missiles. Gromyko assured JFK that the Soviets were committed to only giving Cuba defensive assistance. After a late meeting at the State Department, one more piece of information added to XCOM's alarm. Now they learned that medium-range missiles would be ready to fire in the next 18 hours. The group wavered in its recommendation for a blockade. Kennedy told them to keep talking.
In those years, I definitely had heard of political issues that were stirring at the time. My dad was always very politically active. The Iron Curtain was a big term when I was a kid. I remember trying to picture that as a young boy. What exactly is this Iron Curtain they're talking about? As a child, to know that here I lived in a small town, rural California, I think the city limit sign said 2,000 people. And yet, in 1961-62, it could be impacted by events that were thousands of miles away from home.
It's very important that we have strong leaders in Washington that don't react emotionally, but think things through carefully.
The trust given the president by all who voted for him and those who didn't weighed heavily. During a meeting, he remarked, "This is the week I better earn my salary." For the next 3 days, XCOM met repeatedly, prepared papers on the various options, and finally reached consensus, now called quarantine instead of blockade. The action, intended to halt further development of missiles in Cuba while minimizing the risk to human lives, would be announced to the nation at 7 p.m. on October 22nd. The hope was that when the quarantine became effective on the 24th, diplomats would have gained support of allied countries and legal endorsement from the Organization of American States. Privately, another diplomat, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Adlai Stevenson, suggested a different course: trade U.S. Jupiter missiles in Turkey for Soviet missiles in Cuba. Publicly, his suggestion was rejected. Throughout October 22nd, Streams of dependents from the U.S. base at Guantanamo left Cuba as new reinforcements arrived. At high noon, commanders in Washington, D.C. marshaled military forces in case the quarantine failed to work. 180 Navy ships steamed toward the Caribbean, and ground troops readied for an attack. For the first time in its history, the Air Defense Command ordered all aircraft armed with nuclear weapons, and 1/8 of the B-52 force was ordered airborne around the clock. In 7 hours, all military branches would go to DEFCON 3 alert status.
Out of bed, completely running, literally, as fast as you can, hitting the ladder of the airplane. The power unit was already running because we had airmen that were trained incredibly well. The engine was already warmed up. You get up there, and within 6 minutes, we were taxiing, fully loaded. One B-47 could do total damage for the city of Los Angeles, for example, or Moscow.
By 6:26 p.m., as the president finished meeting with congressional leaders, all key world leaders were notified about the pending quarantine. Their reactions were mixed. De Gaulle in France expressed support. Macmillan in England expressed reserved support. Khrushchev in Russia expressed surprise, then issued orders to Soviet ship captains to ignore the quarantine and hold course for Cuban ports.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
When I first heard about it, I was working in Los Angeles, and the people started talking. It was just word of mouth what was happening. We didn't have any hard facts at first.
See, I was assigned to 2nd Division to go to Cuba. And I didn't know at first that that happened. I found out later. And actually, 2nd Division, parts of the 2nd Division were loading ships in Norfolk, Virginia, getting ready for an attack. I sent a telegram home to Jackie telling her I didn't know if we were going to be able to get married on November 3rd.
You know, I handled it. My mother wasn't too involved. She was just nervous about everything that was happening, and so I pretty much tried to keep her out of the picture as much as possible so she wouldn't be so nervous and worried. I was doing enough for all of us.
Not having television, most of our information came through conversation, hearing my parents talk, either around the dinner table, talking over the newspaper in the evenings. And I just didn't catch on to it as a 7-year-old kid, but I don't remember being overly stressed about it.
Sometime during the 22nd, unbeknown to most decision makers, the first Jupiter missile site was turned over to the Turkish government, setting the stage for a later secret concession to Khrushchev. And unbeknown to most citizens, preparation for war continued through the night, even though President Kennedy had made his position clear. Stop the ships, but be ready to attack if we have to. Kennedy's 7th day into the crisis began before he reached the Oval Office for the first ExComm meeting. At 8 a.m., 13 hours after his speech, he received Khrushchev's official reaction via the Soviet communication agency TASS. It contained phrases like, "a serious threat to peace," "renounce the actions," "catastrophic consequences."
Of course, it was news, and it was bad news, and that had to affect you with some. At least the investors I came in contact with at Dean Witter were old-timers, and they'd been through all this before, so it was no big surprise to them that the Dow Jones would go up and down as it did. I don't recall, but I'm sure it didn't drop over 100 points at the most. But I don't think as a whole that it affected the economy or the actions of the people that much.
XCOM began meeting at 10 a.m. to assess the Soviet reaction and to prepare for a retaliatory Soviet blockade, possibly in Berlin.
I had asked to go to the airborne school. I got $90 more a month
Right.
if I jumped out of airplanes. And during that school was the major part of the Cuban crisis. And then in the back of my mind was a Berlin situation. I thought that that's what I might end up going to is Europe for war. And here it was, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
According to intelligence reports, Cuba's military forces, now 270,000 men strong, were placed on high alert minutes before XCOM gathered for the evening session. During the next hour, they learned that an extraordinary number of coded messages had been relayed to the Soviet ships, and Russian subs were moving to the Caribbean. Just before 7 p.m., Kennedy fired off a message to Khrushchev urging observance of the quarantine and that both sides show prudence. At 7:05, he signed Proclamation 3504 into law and formally established the quarantine, now also formally endorsed by the OAS. The first ships and the possible start of nuclear war would approach the quarantine boundary when XCOM convened the next morning. Most Americans slept uneasily that night, with no idea what the day would bring.
Well, that was just it. There was, that element of unknown, what to do, how to prepare, what should you do. And so basically everyone just sort of went on with their normal day-to-day routine. You just listened to the news and waited to see what was going to happen and how it was going to really affect your life. Basically, there wasn't anything to do but just be patient and wait and hope for the best.
When the Russians were getting close to Cuba, that's when it became very, very hairy.
That anxiety was shared by Americans and Russians alike. A contact in Moscow reported that Khrushchev was near exhaustion and sometimes incoherent, even pressing a meaningless message for Kennedy on an American businessman he summoned to the Kremlin. But Russian leaders weren't the only ones feeling the pressure.
There was a revolution in Cuba, and basically it was supported by Soviet Union, and it could result in the Third World War. Everybody was expecting this.
Weary from events of the past week, the president remarked to his brother, "It looks really mean, doesn't it?" Robert Kennedy replied, "I don't think there was any choice. If you hadn't acted, you would have been impeached." At mid-morning, the drama heightened. McNamara reported 20 Russian ships just miles from the quarantine line, guarded now by the carrier USS Essex. Minutes later, a Soviet submarine maneuvered between the ships and the carrier, as if to intervene. Then the Russian ship stopped dead in the water. First 6, then 12 turned slowly around and began steaming away from Cuba. But 8 ships refused to turn back.
It was scary, and what those ships went through out there on the sea. I mean, imagine the control that the captains had on those ships and how they had to follow orders. I mean, one person could have just pressed a button or given the wrong order, and that could have started it.
In case something did start, civil defense measures were initiated to protect as many people as possible.
I guess for me, the strongest image I would remember from those days in 61, 62 would be the bus drills. They would load us on buses and take us out to an agricultural loading station out in the country. The vacant concrete slab on the corner of a couple rural roads. Our parents were supposed to meet us there in case of an attack. I mean, there may have been a little bit of child apprehension there. Well, what if this really does happen? But I think they just explained to us this was just a practice. I definitely remember that these were tied in with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I didn't go dig any shelters like a lot of people did. I didn't think it was going to happen. I couldn't see Russia trying to start a confrontation with the U.S., but I was 50 years younger then, and so consequently, I took that stuff in stride a lot better than I would today.
Even in small town America, there were extreme measures taken in case of an attack. We weren't isolated from world events.
And world events focused on the U.S. again, as the remaining Soviet ships steamed toward the first direct confrontation of the crisis. In expectation, the Strategic Air Command's defense posture was upgraded to DEFCON 2, one step away from nuclear attack.
DEFCON 2, there was definitely, I'll never forget, the complete change of mood within the combat crews. You know, I mean, just the two of us, three of us. You talk less. Everything is extremely serious, and you don't do it intentionally. By that I mean, you go into a mode of calmness, if you will. You don't want to talk.
DEFCON 2 communicated an important message to military forces at home and to the Russians who were watching Kennedy. As the long day ended, Dean Rusk's comment from that morning circulated throughout the White House. We were eyeball to eyeball, and the other fellow just blinked. It expressed the relief everyone felt. At 9:24 p.m., a letter from Khrushchev arrived for Kennedy. In one paragraph, Khrushchev proposed a summit. In the next, he deemed the quarantine a pirate action that the Soviet Union will defend against the aggressor. The morning's relief faded with the rising moon. Throughout the night, and next day, and next night, Kennedy slept little, while a Soviet oil tanker named Bucharest had already reached the quarantine line and was allowed to continue. The real confrontation would come on this day, the 26th, when armed American sailors boarded the Maruka to search for contraband.
I believe that they thought the same way as I did, that Russia didn't dare start a confrontation with the United States because they weren't capable of carrying it out.
At 7 a.m., when the Maruka reached the boundary, it was boarded and inspected without incident. It did appear that the Russians had backed down. That was the good news. The bad news came during the 10 a.m. XCOM meeting. A new CIA report showed construction of intermediate-range missile bases was still underway, and now some medium-range missiles were armed and ready to fire. The president's belief in the effectiveness of the quarantine faltered. By the end of the meeting, he feared that only an invasion or some sort of trade would work. McNamara ended the morning by reporting the number of casualties Kennedy could expect if an invasion took place. Over 18,000 Americans dead within the first 10 days.
I know I wasn't aware of the devastation that could happen if the missiles were fired, but I was aware, somewhat as a 7-year-old, that there was that sense of urgency about the drills that we did.
The possibility of a deal with Russia to prevent casualties dimmed with a message from the U.S. ambassador to Turkey. Officials there expressed deep resentment at suggestions to trade their Jupiter missiles for those in Cuba. That evening, a long emotional letter from Khrushchev began arriving at the State Department. Sent via the U.S. Embassy in Moscow some 9 hours earlier, it was 9 that night before the complete message reached Kennedy. It was hopeful, conciliatory, and likely written by Khrushchev personally, but without the approval of his political cohorts. It was also the subject of XCOM's final meeting of the day. As XCOM considered an answer to Khrushchev's letter, Fidel Castro heard of the U.S. military buildup and headed for a bomb shelter in the Soviet embassy in Havana. From there, he proposed a preemptive nuclear strike to Khrushchev. Late that night, Robert Kennedy left the White House to meet secretly with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin. In spite of the message from Turkey, his brother instructed him to offer the Russians a deal if they bring it up. RFK's job was to delicately arrange the trade while insisting that no one besides Khrushchev know about it. The worst day of the crisis began early. 15 minutes into the morning ExCom meeting, a U-2 spy plane wandered into Soviet airspace over the Bering Sea. An F-102 and Russian MiG scrambled. The pilot was able to change course before confrontation. But when he heard about it, McNamara yelled hysterically, "This means war." They had been sitting on the razor's edge of disaster for more than 10 days. Within an hour of the U-2 incident, the text of a new Khrushchev message reached the president. Contrary to yesterday's letter, this one was likely written by politicals rather than Khrushchev himself. In it, the Soviets stated that they would only remove the Cuban missiles if the United States did the same in Turkey.
Khrushchev was trying to blackmail Kennedy. He wanted us to remove missiles in Turkey, and I guess that was top secret at the time, and so not many of us knew about that. And it's amazing because you hear later that we had bombers in the sky heading for Europe.
At noon, the situation escalated again when Kennedy got word of a more deadly U-2 confrontation. One of the original planes that first discovered the missiles had been shot down over Cuba. Its pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, killed. Days ago, ExCom had agreed to a retaliatory strike if this happened. In response to the U-2 incident, McNamara asked the Air Force to call 14,000 reservists to duty. In all, 24 troop carrier squadrons and their supporting units. As McNamara prepared for a military response, Kennedy wrestled with his own response to Khrushchev. Which letter would he answer? The conciliatory one or the hardline one he received last? Time was running out on both sides of the world. As the hours passed with no word from Khrushchev, Kennedy wondered if he acted wisely. Do the Russians want war? Would an attack now prevent deaths later? This may have been the moment he chose to use something other than the traditional communication channels at the State Department, at the embassies. This may have been the moment he knew the world's future demanded that two men put aside propriety, the past, and politics to let humanity prevail. After ExCom advisors stalemated over the issue, Robert Kennedy and Ted Sorensen left to privately draft the final letter. A compilation of favorable points from both Khrushchev letters, a response to an offer that was never really made. New information suggests that, contrary to historical accounts, Kennedy and Khrushchev struck a secret deal in the middle of the night with the help of trusted interpreters. A deal during which Khrushchev banished the bravado, saying plainly, "We don't want war." And Kennedy agreed to dismantle the missiles in Turkey. After the deal was struck, emotionally drained and exhausted from too little sleep, Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy nearly collapsed. But the world was spared.
It's a weird feeling in that when they had us turned around, it was tough to concentrate on what you had to do to get home safely.
Early on the 28th, Robert Kennedy left the White House to take his daughters to a horse show. Just as early, JFK left the White House to attend church. Jackie was still in Virginia with the children. It would be another 2 hours before Khrushchev's public response arrived at the State Department.
I had no idea how they were communicating at all, but I figured that we had some technology where the leaders of those countries could communicate with each other quick enough where they could realize how serious each side was.
For a brief 5 hours, John Kennedy joined his family in Virginia to rest, to prepare, and then he returned to preside over a weary nation for whom time nearly ran out 13 days ago. The two brothers reflected on those 13 days. After a quiet moment, the president quipped, "Maybe this is the night I should go to the theater." They laughed, and Robert added, "If you go, I want to go with you." It's been nearly 40 years since the U.S., Cuba, and the Soviet Union came face to face with the specter of nuclear war. So what was the point? Why relive a time none would want to live again? Because for old scars to fade, pivotal events like these must be reconciled.
What has happened to the stock market recently, I don't understand. In those days, we valued a stock as to earnings and dividends, etc. Today, there doesn't seem to matter.
Just before my term in active duty ended, I had a 3-day pass, so I took Jackie to Panama City, Florida on a 50cc Honda. One of the first things that I remember is when I walked on the beach, it was a different kind of sand. And I was told by those around that that's the kind of sand that are most of the Caribbean islands. And I just visualized in my mind what it would have been like to attack Cuba with all these shells in the landing and people dropping and not knowing what was going to happen. And I was just so happy that I didn't have to go through that.
Eventually, the day came when he was through and we were able to come back and start our life together here.
In 1949, I think it was Time magazine, interviewed some prominent Americans asking them what life would be like in the year 2000. And as is typical, most of them were terrible prognosticators of what life would be like in this country in the year 2000. They all said we would have a woman president by now, which we don't. They all said a cure for cancer would be found by year 2000, which we haven't. But maybe on the positive side, they all felt that we would have World War III before year 2000 arrived. And I'm grateful that that didn't come true. I hope people understand better today the value of peace, the value of life.
I would want my children to try to comprehend the importance of being prepared to defend a way of life.
So the point again, to learn. To remember it can happen again. At home, or in Cuba, or Russia, or Bosnia, or Palestine, or Iraq.